Now that we've established what the Togaf standard is, the next question becomes very important. Why is Togaf suitable as a framework for enterprise architecture? The answer is that Togaf standard gives organizations a structured, standardized, and lower-risk way to develop and sustain architecture. In simple terms, enterprise architecture is not easy work. It involves many people, many decisions, technical complexity, and constant change. Togaf helps by giving a clear method, a common structure, and practical guidance, so the organization does not have to invent everything from scratch. That is why Togaf is not just useful, it is suitable. It helps architecture work become more consistent, more stakeholder-focused, more practical, and more sustainable. Now let's break that down properly. One of the first reasons Togaf is suitable is because developing and sustaining enterprise architecture is a technically complex process. Architecture has to deal with business strategy, processes, information, applications, technology, governance, change, and long-term evolution. So this is not a single technical task, it is an enterprise-wide discipline with many moving parts. And that complexity is only one side of the challenge. Enterprise architecture also involves many stakeholders. It involves executives, business leaders, architects, delivery teams, governance bodies, risk and compliance teams, procurement, and operational managers. Each of these groups has different priorities and different perspectives. That means architecture is difficult not only because of technical complexity, but also because of organizational and even political complexity. A framework is needed to create order, consistency, and alignment across all of these stakeholders. So now the next question becomes, what exactly does Togaf provide that makes it suitable? One important reason is that Togaf provides a standardized approach. A standardized approach means the organization has common terminology, a repeatable method, shared expectations, and a consistent way to plan and manage architecture work. Without that, different teams may produce inconsistent architecture outputs, use different assumptions, and make architecture harder to govern. The section also says that Togaf de-risks enterprise architecture activity. That means it reduces the chance of architecture work becoming inconsistent, fragmented, poorly governed, disconnected from stakeholder needs, or blind to important risks and future requirements. Now, that does not mean Togaf removes all risk. It does not, but it does reduce avoidable risk by giving structure, best practices, and guidance. That is an important distinction to remember. Another reason Togaf is suitable is that it helps produce consistent architecture. Consistency means the architecture is developed using a coherent method. Outputs relate to one another, stakeholders can understand the structure, and governance can be applied more reliably. This matters because architecture usually spans multiple teams, multiple domains, and long periods of time. Without consistency, architecture becomes difficult to trust and difficult to use. Closely connected to that is another key point. The resulting architecture reflects the needs of stakeholders. Architecture is not for architects alone. It must be useful to business decision makers, delivery teams, governance bodies, and operational leaders. A good framework helps architecture take stakeholder needs seriously instead of focusing only on what designers want to produce. Architecture is also suitable because it employs best practice. That means it draws on proven, stable, and mature approaches, rather than requiring every organization to invent its architecture discipline from zero. This makes architecture work more practical and more credible. And then the section adds another very important point. Togaf gives due consideration to both current requirements and perceived future business needs. That balance is critical. Enterprise architecture must help the organization operate today while preparing for tomorrow. If architecture focuses only on the present, it becomes short-sighted. If it focuses only on the future, it may become unrealistic or disconnected from delivery. Togaf supports that balance, and that is one of the strongest reasons it is suitable as a framework. Now let's move into the section's specific reasons in a more structured way. The first specific reason is that Togaf provides a standard cycle of change. This is one of the strongest reasons it is suitable. Architecture is not static. The enterprise changes over time, so architecture must support a repeatable cycle for planning, development, implementation, governance, change, and sustainability. This is handled through the Togaf ADM, the Architecture Development Method. Why does that matter? Because the ADM gives architects a structured process for working through architecture in a disciplined way, instead of relying on ad hoc decisions. The second specific reason is that Togaf provides a definition and description of building blocks. These are the building blocks in an enterprise used to deliver business services and information systems. This is linked to the Togaf content framework. The idea of building blocks is important because enterprises are made up of components that work together. Togaf helps define and organize those components so architects can understand what exists, what is needed, and how parts relate. Without a structured view of enterprise building blocks, architecture can become vague, overly abstract, or disconnected from actual implementation. The third specific reason is that Togaf provides guidelines, techniques, and advice. And this is very important because frameworks are only useful if they help in practice. Togaf does not stop at high-level theory. It also provides guidance, techniques, practical advice, and support for solution-level change delivery. The section says this support applies at all levels of scale, pace, and detail. That means Togaf can be used for small or large enterprises, for slower or faster change environments, and for high-level strategic views or more detailed architecture work. This flexibility is a major reason why Togaf is suitable across many different contexts. So now let's bring all of that together into one simple logic. Togaf works as a suitable enterprise architecture framework in a step-by-step way. First, it provides a common architecture foundation. That gives the organization a standard approach and a shared language. Second, it structures the architecture process. Using the ADM, the organization follows a defined cycle of change rather than an improvised method. Third, it helps involve stakeholders consistently. The framework helps ensure stakeholder needs are identified and reflected in architecture work. Fourth, it defines enterprise building blocks. Using the content framework, architects describe the parts of the enterprise that deliver business services and information systems. Fifth, it applies best practices, guidelines, and techniques. That gives practical support for creating and sustaining effective architecture. Sixth, it supports implementation and change governance, so architecture remains useful during implementation, governance, and ongoing evolution. And seventh, it supports architecture over time, not only in development, but also in maintenance and adaptation as business needs change. So the logic in one sentence is this. Togaf is suitable because it combines a structured process, defined architecture content, and practical guidance into one framework that makes enterprise architecture more consistent, usable, and lower risk. Now let's make that even easier to visualize. Togaf works because the enterprise begins with complexity and many stakeholders. Into that environment, the Togaf standard introduces structure, and it does that through the ADM, the content framework, and guidance. The result is more consistent, stakeholder-focused, best practice architecture, and that leads to better governed and lower risk enterprise change. That is the flow. The framework takes a difficult environment and introduces process, content, and guidance in a way that improves architecture quality and reduces risk. Let's ground that in a practical example. Imagine a large retail bank wants to modernize customer onboarding, branch operations, digital channels, and compliance controls. That work is complex because it involves executives, compliance teams, operations, technology, customer service, and external vendors. Without a framework, teams may define architecture differently, stakeholders may disagree on priorities, outputs may be inconsistent, current needs may override long-term design, or future ambitions may ignore operational reality. With Togaf, the bank uses the ADM to structure the architecture cycle. Architects define enterprise building blocks, such as customer data, onboarding services, applications, and technology platforms. Stakeholder concerns are gathered and reflected. Guidance and techniques support practical architecture development. Implementation is governed against the architecture, and the bank balances regulatory needs today with digital ambitions for tomorrow. The result is architecture that is more coherent, more governable, and more useful in real change delivery. So let's close this section with the key takeaways. Togaf is suitable as a framework because enterprise architecture is complex and involves many stakeholders. It provides a standardized approach that reduces risk. It helps produce architecture that is consistent and stakeholder-focused. It uses best practices rather than leaving organizations to invent their own methods. It balances current requirements with future business needs. It provides a standard cycle of change through the Togaf ADM. It defines enterprise building blocks through the Togaf content framework, and it offers guidelines, techniques, and advice for architecture creation, maintenance, and change delivery. It also supports work across different scales, speeds, and levels of detail. From an exam perspective, a common question from this section is, why is Togaf suitable as a framework for enterprise architecture? The strongest answers usually include the standardized approach, reduced risk, consistency, stakeholder needs, best practices, the ADM, the content framework, and practical guidance. A weaker distractor may mention only one feature, such as saying that Togaf is suitable because it defines technology standards. But the correct answer is broader than that. Togaf is suitable because it provides a full framework for architecture process, content, and guidance. There are also a few common mistakes to watch for. One mistake is thinking Togaf is suitable only because it is popular. Another is reducing Togaf to just the ADM and forgetting the content framework and guidance. Another is assuming enterprise architecture is mainly a technical activity and not a stakeholder-heavy process. Another is forgetting that Togaf supports both current and future needs. Another is believing that a framework removes all risk. It reduces risk, but it does not eliminate it. And finally, another is confusing building blocks with only physical technology components. And finally, here is the practitioner insight that makes this section real. In real projects, Togaf becomes most valuable when architecture work starts getting messy. That usually happens when too many stakeholders are involved, transformation spans multiple domains, teams need consistency, and leadership wants confidence that architecture is not just theoretical. Practitioners often appreciate Togaf because it gives them something stronger than personal opinion. It gives them a recognized method, a content structure, and a body of guidance they can use to justify decisions and organize work. In practice, organizations rarely adopt every part of Togaf in a rigid way. But the reason they keep returning to it is simple. It helps architecture become disciplined, repeatable, and easier to govern.